The judge's wife messed with the wrong lawyer, and the next day's surprise shocked everyone. Rebecca Coleman had grown accustomed to the rhythm of Boston's upper circles, the carefully curated calendar of charity luncheons, benefit galas, and discreetly competitive committee meetings. Her presence was both expected and quietly influential. As the wife of Judge Thomas Coleman, she carried herself with a blend of warmth and unspoken authority. People sought her out for connections, for advice, or simply for the reassurance that being in her good graces could open doors. In return, she gave attention sparingly, but with enough grace to leave people feeling they had earned something rare. That Thursday morning, the city was touched by an early spring chill, the kind that made the sunlight sharper against the brick buildings and gave the air a faint metallic edge. Rebecca's driver left her in front of the historic Beacon Hill Club, where a charity luncheon for legal aid services was about to begin. She wore a tailored navy dress, a string of pearls, and the kind of understated confidence that made her noticeable without needing to speak. Inside, the room buzzed with the polite hum of greetings, the clink of glasses, and the shifting shuffle of chairs on polished wood floors. She moved through the crowd, exchanging light conversation with district attorneys, law professors, and philanthropists whose fortunes had outlasted several market crashes. The event was as predictable as ever, until, while being introduced to a small group near the windows, her attention caught on a new face. A woman in her early 30s, sharply dressed in a charcoal suit, stood with the posture of someone accustomed to both defending herself and holding her ground. "Rebecca, may I introduce Emma Harris?" said a mutual acquaintance, gesturing between them. "One of our city's rising defense attorneys." Rebecca extended her hand with a practiced smile. "Pleasure to meet you, Ms. Harris." "The pleasure is mine," Emma replied, her handshake firm, her eyes steady in a way that felt almost evaluative. The exchange was brief, but the air between them seemed to shift. Rebecca, though skilled at reading a room, could not immediately place why. Emma did not appear hostile, yet there was something in her gaze, a kind of silent challenge, as though she were measuring Rebecca against a standard unspoken but very present. The conversation drifted back to the group, but Rebecca found her mind lingering on the young attorney. The luncheon proceeded with the usual rhythm: opening remarks, applause for sponsors, a keynote address delivered with just enough warmth to disguise its rehearsed quality. Rebecca sat at a table near the front, the kind of placement that suggested prominence without seeming ostentatious. Emma was at a different table across the room, but Rebecca noticed her occasionally glancing in her direction. By the time the main course had been cleared, Rebecca had catalogued the details: Emma's self-assured way of speaking, her attentive listening, the faintest suggestion of guardedness in her expressions. She could not recall ever crossing paths with her before, yet the atmosphere between them seemed touched by something more than a simple first meeting. Dessert arrived, individual lemon tarts with delicate sugar dusting, and conversation flowed lightly. Rebecca was drawn into a discussion about recent high-profile cases, the kind that everyone in the room had opinions on but few had been directly involved with. As her table laughed at a light anecdote from a judge, Rebecca glanced again toward Emma, who was now speaking with animated conviction to someone beside her. It was in this moment, with the easy sweetness of the dessert before her and the polite murmur of Boston's legal elite surrounding her, that Rebecca decided to speak up in a way that would turn the day's events into something far less ordinary. What she was about to say would be brief, seemingly casual, but it would set in motion a chain of events she could neither predict nor fully control. The hum of conversation in the Beacon Hill Club's ballroom had the steady rhythm of polite society, soft laughter, the careful cadence of professionals avoiding anything that might be too revealing in mixed company. But at Rebecca Coleman's table, that balance was about to tip. The discussion had turned toward a recent trial that had caught the city's attention. A man accused of embezzlement from a mid-sized tech firm had walked free after months of proceedings. One of the guests, a middle-aged attorney from Cambridge, mentioned the cleverness of the defense, noting how the case seemed unwinnable until the last week. Another nodded in agreement, adding that the defense had been ruthlessly effective. Rebecca, who had been silent until then, set her wineglass down and glanced toward Emma Harris's table. She spoke in an even tone, not loud, but with enough clarity for those nearby to hear. "Effective, perhaps," she said, "but I wonder how much of that victory was due to skill, and how much was simply exploiting technical loopholes. The sentence was casual on the surface, but the words hung in the air heavier than intended. Across the room, Emma's head turned slightly, her attention clearly caught. The surrounding conversation faltered. A few guests exchanged uncertain glances, unsure whether to treat Rebecca's remark as playful ribbing or pointed criticism. Emma did not immediately respond. Instead, she excused herself from her table and crossed the room with the deliberate pace of someone deciding how much weight to give the moment. When she reached Rebecca's table, she smiled politely. "Mrs. Coleman," she began, her voice even but edged with steel. "I assume you are referring to the Whitford case?" Rebecca returned the smile. It seems to have been on everyone's lips today. Emma clasped her hands in front of her, her posture unshaken. "Then perhaps you already know that the so-called loophole you mention was in fact a clear violation of due process by the prosecution. It was the court's decision to dismiss the evidence, not mine. My job was to ensure my client's rights were protected." There was no rise in her voice, but her words cut with precision. Rebecca's tablemates shifted uncomfortably, glancing between the two women. A few forks paused mid-air, the lemon tarts momentarily forgotten. Rebecca tilted her head slightly, as if considering whether to escalate or diffuse. "Of course," she said lightly. "We all know the law is as much about procedure as truth." Emma's gaze held steady, her expression controlled. "It's about ensuring truth is reached without breaking the rules that protect all of us, even those who would prefer different outcomes." The tension between them was unmistakable now. It wasn't the loud, public kind that draws a crowd, but the quiet, deliberate exchange of two people testing each other's resolve in front of an audience who pretended not to notice. Someone at the table attempted to redirect the conversation toward the keynote speaker's earlier remarks, but the moment had already etched itself into memory. Emma stepped back, her smile returning, but without warmth. "Enjoy the rest of your luncheon, Mrs. Coleman," she said before returning to her table. The movement was graceful, but it felt like the closing move in a match neither had expected to play. The room's chatter slowly resumed, though Rebecca noticed a certain energy in the air, the kind that follows any unexpected confrontation in a space where appearances matter. People pretended to focus on their meals, yet their attention kept drifting toward the young attorney, who had met Rebecca's remark head-on. Rebecca sipped her water, keeping her composure. She had not intended to provoke more than mild discomfort, yet Emma's reaction had been sharper than anticipated. There was no visible anger, only a steady, deliberate refusal to let the comment pass unchallenged. For someone Rebecca had just met, Emma had made her position clear. She was not easily intimidated. As the luncheon wound down, polite farewells and business card exchanges resumed, but Rebecca caught herself glancing toward Emma more often than she liked to admit. There was something about the young attorney's measured response, not loud enough to cause a scene, yet precise enough to draw blood, that lingered in her mind. She left the Beacon Hill Club that afternoon with a vague sense of imbalance. Her remark had been meant to assert quiet dominance, the kind she wielded so often in these circles without consequence. Instead, she felt as though she had stepped into a conversation that would not end simply because she wished it to. What no one else in that room knew, not the judges, not the lawyers, not the philanthropists discussing their next committee meetings, was that Emma Harris was not the kind of person to leave a challenge unanswered. She was not impulsive, not the type to send a heated letter or start a public feud, but she had a talent for precision in both her words and her actions. And though Rebecca did not yet know it, the remark she had made over lemon tarts would echo beyond that ballroom, finding its way back to her in ways she could not anticipate. Emma might have walked away smiling, but she had already begun deciding what her next move would be. By the time Rebecca returned home that afternoon, the earlier confrontation had begun to replay itself in fragments, the way certain exchanges tend to echo in the mind, no matter how one tries to set them aside. The Colemans lived in a restored townhouse, on a quiet street lined with elms, the kind of neighborhood where the occasional sound of a delivery truck or a barking dog punctuated otherwise uninterrupted calm. Inside, the air smelled faintly of the fresh lilies that her housekeeper arranged in the hallway vase each Thursday. Rebecca slipped off her coat, greeted the housekeeper with a polite nod, and went upstairs to change before the evening's dinner plans. She did not think of Emma again until later that evening. as she stood by her bedroom window, looking out at the dim glow of the street lamps. It was not guilt she felt. She had spoken no outright falsehoods, but rather an uneasy curiosity. Emma's composure at the luncheon had been unflinching, and in Rebecca's experience, people who could absorb criticism without visible anger often carried it elsewhere, letting it manifest in ways that did not rely on public confrontation. The next morning began as any other. Judge Coleman had already left for court before Rebecca came down to breakfast. She sipped her coffee slowly, scanning the headlines in the paper without particular interest. Outside, a light mist blurred the view of the street. She was halfway through an article about a new infrastructure proposal when the doorbell rang. It was unusual for anyone to call unannounced at that hour. The housekeeper, glancing to Rebecca for instruction, went to answer. Moments later, she returned holding a plain white envelope, its surface slightly damp from the mist. "This was on the doorstep, madam," she said. "No postage, just sitting there." Rebecca took the envelope, its weight light, the paper thick. There was no name, no return address. She slid a manicured finger under the flap and pulled out a single sheet of paper, neatly typed in black ink. The message was short. "You might want to be careful about the stories you tell. No signature, no date, no other markings." The phrasing was precise, almost formal, the kind of language a lawyer might use, neither overtly threatening nor entirely benign. Rebecca read it twice, her eyes narrowing. "Who delivered this?" she asked, though she knew the housekeeper could not answer. The woman shook her head, explaining that she had not seen anyone near the porch that morning. Rebecca carried the letter to her study and set it on the desk. Her first thought was of Emma. The connection was almost too obvious. The luncheon, the pointed exchange, the cool dismissal. It would fit, a subtle warning, calculated to unsettle. And yet Rebecca could not ignore the absence of proof. The style was deliberate, but she had no handwriting, no witness, no link except instinct. She sat for a long moment in the quiet room, the ticking of the mantel clock marking each second with irritating precision. She was not easily rattled, but she was no stranger to subtext. In her circles, messages were often sent in ways that could be denied if questioned directly. The anonymity of the envelope meant whoever had sent it understood how to make a point without exposing themselves. Rebecca considered the possibility of ignoring it, treating it as nothing more than a petty attempt at intimidation, but she knew herself well enough to admit she would not be able to forget it so easily. Her life operated on the understanding that she controlled her narrative, both socially and privately. An anonymous note left in such a way was a disruption, and disruptions demanded attention. She reread the letter a third time, searching for nuance in the choice of words. "You might want to be careful." The phrase was advisory rather than accusatory, yet it carried the weight of someone confident in their knowledge. This was not an idle insult hurled in public. This was crafted for her eyes alone. By late morning, she had folded the note and locked it in a small box in her desk drawer. She did not yet know if she would mention it to Thomas. Her husband valued clarity in all things, and without proof of its origin, the matter would seem too vague to warrant action. Still, she made a mental note of the day's date and the details of the delivery. Throughout the afternoon, she moved through her errands with an unusual sharpness of perception. Every face on the street seemed more watchful than usual. Every glance held the possibility of recognition. When she passed a man loitering near the florist's window, she wondered if he had been near her house earlier. A woman speaking quietly on her phone outside the cafe might have been relaying something entirely unrelated, but in Rebecca's mind, she could just as easily have been describing her. By evening, she told herself that the matter might fade quickly, as most small provocations do. Yet she could not entirely dismiss the possibility that this was merely an opening move in something larger. The calm of her home felt slightly thinner, as though the edges of her privacy had been touched by an unseen hand. When she went upstairs for the night, the locked drawer in her study seemed heavier than it should have been. The note was silent now, its words dormant on paper, but she knew the act of sending it had already shifted the dynamic between herself and Emma Harris, at least in her own mind. She did not yet know that by the next morning, the quiet warning would no longer be the most unsettling thing to appear on her doorstep. Friday morning arrived with the pale light of early spring filtering through the tall windows of Rebecca Coleman's townhouse. The mist from the previous day had lifted, Leaving the street slick with the remnants of overnight rain, Rebecca descended the staircase with the expectation of a quiet breakfast and perhaps an hour to herself before engaging with the day's obligations. Her husband had left early again, his court schedule demanding. The house was still, save for the faint hum of the heating system. She was halfway to the kitchen when she noticed the door's brass mail slot slightly ajar. The housekeeper, who usually collected the Morning Post promptly, had not yet done so. Rebecca approached, pulling the door open, to find not the neat stack of letters she expected, but a large manila folder placed squarely in the center of the welcome mat. The folder's surface was smooth but bore faint watermarks from the damp night air. There was no name, no label, only the sharp crease of its flap, sealed with a strip of transparent tape. Rebecca glanced up and down the street. The morning was calm. A lone jogger passed on the opposite sidewalk, and a delivery truck turned the corner a block away. She bent to retrieve the folder, the weight of its contents noticeable, but not heavy. Closing the door behind her, she carried it into the study and laid it on the desk. With deliberate care, she peeled back the tape and opened the flap. Inside were neatly arranged papers, photocopies of community grant reports from the past several years. Rebecca recognized the documents immediately. They pertained to the Hopewell Literacy Foundation, a charity she chaired that focused on providing reading programs for underprivileged children. At first glance, nothing in the reports appeared out of place. The pages contained the expected columns of figures, expense categories, and notations from board meetings. But as she began to scan more closely, she noticed certain lines had been subtly marked in faint pencil: catering costs that seemed high for small events, transportation expenses slightly above standard, consultancy fees without detailed explanations. Individually, none of these would warrant concern, but taken together they could be arranged into a story less flattering than the truth. Rebecca felt a slow tightening in her chest. She knew these figures intimately. Every decision, every budget line had passed through the board with her oversight. None of it was illegal, but she could see how someone inclined toward suspicion might frame the narrative differently. Public perception did not always wait for proof. The mere suggestion of impropriety could stain reputations beyond repair. She spread the pages out across the desk. Each report was dated, organized chronologically, as though someone had spent careful time gathering and compiling them. The earliest was from 5 years ago, the most recent from just last quarter. It was not the type of collection one stumbled upon accidentally. Whoever had delivered this had both access and intent. Her mind returned immediately to the note from the day before. You might want to be careful about the stories you tell. The two events seemed connected, their sequence too deliberate to be coincidence. If the note had been the opening statement, this folder was the evidence. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, staring at the spread of papers. If Emma Harris was behind this, the young attorney had moved quickly, compiling years' worth of material in less than 24 hours. That implied either remarkable efficiency or pre-existing possession of the documents. The latter possibility was unsettling. These reports were not classified, but neither were they casually distributed. Copies existed in the charity's records, in the files of certain board members, and with the accountants. Access required more than curiosity. It required position or cooperation from someone who had it. She considered whether Emma might have allies on the board or in the administrative offices. Though Rebecca's relationship with most members was cordial, there had been moments of disagreement over the years. A single disgruntled individual could have seen in Emma an opportunity to embarrass the chairwoman. Yet another possibility took shape in her mind. Perhaps Emma was not the source, but merely another player who had encountered this information. If someone else intended to use it, Emma could simply be a bystander, or worse, a witness who had yet to decide which side to stand on. Rebecca began to gather the documents back into the folder, her movements slow and deliberate. The act of touching them felt strangely intrusive, as though she were handling someone else's property, rather than her own organization's reports. She placed the folder in the desk drawer, locking it alongside the anonymous note. Two pieces of an unfolding puzzle, neither yet fitting cleanly into place. The house felt different now, the warmth of the morning replaced by a quiet vigilance. Every sound from the street, the slam of a car door, the roll of bicycle tires over wet pavement, drew her attention. Rebecca had always valued control over her environment, both in public and at home. Now, for the second day in a row, something had arrived uninvited, shifting the boundaries she maintained so carefully. She told herself she would not be intimidated. But as she sat in the study, hands resting on the closed drawer, she could not deny the question growing in her mind, persistent and unwelcome. How had Emma Harris, if indeed she was responsible, gotten her hands on this? And if it was not Emma, then who else had both the motive and the means to place such a folder at her door without being seen? Rebecca did not yet know that before she could settle on an answer, she would feel compelled to look the young attorney in the eye again, and this time, the conversation would be far less about pleasantries. By Saturday morning, the folder and the anonymous note had become constant companions in Rebecca's thoughts. She had locked them away, but their presence seemed to hum from the desk drawer, demanding her attention no matter what else she tried to occupy herself with. Her usual strategy in such matters, to wait, observe, and let others reveal their intentions, felt inadequate this time. She needed to understand Emma Harris's role, if any, before the situation could grow into something she could not manage. Rather than arrange a direct meeting, which would make her intentions too obvious, Rebecca devised something subtler. She knew of a cafe on Charles Street where members of the legal community often stopped for coffee on weekend mornings. It was small, with a single front window and a steady flow of customers who preferred it over the noisier chains. Through a contact at the luncheon committee, she learned that Emma sometimes met colleagues there after early client consultations. Rebecca arrived just after 10 o'clock, dressed in a cream coat and a scarf in muted tones, choosing a table by the window where she could see the door. She ordered a cappuccino she had no intention of finishing quickly. The air inside carried the scent of ground coffee beans and warm pastries, layered over the murmur of quiet conversation. It was only 15 minutes before Emma entered. She wore dark jeans, a tailored black coat, and a burgundy sweater that softened her otherwise precise appearance. She carried no files, suggesting this was not a business meeting. Emma approached the counter, exchanged a brief greeting with the barista, and ordered. Rebecca waited until Emma had her drink in hand before making her move. She stood as if by coincidence, her expression one of mild surprise. "Miss Harris," she said warmly. "What a pleasant surprise." Emma turned, her eyes narrowing just slightly before she smiled. "Mrs. Coleman, good morning. I did not expect to see you here," Rebecca continued, gesturing toward the small cluster of empty tables. "Would you care to join me for a moment?" There was a brief pause, as though Emma were measuring the request against her own plans. Then she nodded. All right. They sat, and for a few moments the conversation remained light. Comments about the weather, the usual small talk. Then Rebecca leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "I wanted to say that our exchange at the luncheon, well, I hope it did not come across as personal. It was an open conversation, and perhaps my tone was sharper than I intended." Emma stirred her coffee slowly, the spoon clinking softly against the cup. "I appreciate the clarification," she said, her tone neutral, "but I stand by my response. My work depends on precision, in the courtroom and outside of it." Rebecca allowed herself a polite smile. Of course, precision is an admirable quality. She let the words hang a moment before continuing. "Speaking of which, I've been thinking about the case we discussed. It reminded me how easily details can be reframed. A victory can be seen as skill by one person and opportunism by another. Context is everything." Emma's gaze sharpened. "Yes," she said evenly. "And sometimes people draw conclusions without knowing all the facts." There was an opening there, but Rebecca did not want to lunge for it too directly. Instead, she let her voice take on an almost casual air. "I ask because I've recently come across some documents relating to my work with the Hopewell Literacy Foundation. Nothing of real consequence, of course, but it made me wonder how certain information finds its way into unexpected hands." Emma didn't look away, but her expression remained unreadable. "Information has a way of moving when people are looking for it. That's true in legal cases, in business, and in charity work." She took a sip of her coffee before adding, "And sometimes, Mrs. Coleman, people come across things by accident, though in my experience, accidents are rarer than we like to think." Rebecca studied her for a long moment, trying to detect any hint of confirmation or denial. The young attorney's face revealed nothing. "I suppose you're right," Rebecca said, letting the smallest note of amusement into her voice. "It's a reminder that our reputations depend as much on perception as reality." Emma set down her cup, her tone shifting ever so slightly. "Reputations can be fragile things, Mrs. Coleman. That's why I protect mine carefully, and why I assume you do the same." The remark was calm, almost courteous, yet layered in a way that made Rebecca's pulse quicken. It was not a threat, not even an accusation, but it was an acknowledgement of shared understanding. They were speaking about something without naming it, circling an unspoken truth neither wished to lay out plainly. Rebecca leaned back, offering a faint smile. "Indeed. It's always wise to be careful." Emma glanced at her watch. "I should be going. Enjoy your coffee." She rose and, without waiting for Rebecca to stand, walked toward the door, the faint jingle of the bell marking her exit. Rebecca remained seated, the last of her cappuccino gone lukewarm. Emma's words replayed in her mind, the deliberate phrasing, the absence of denial, the calm assurance. The conversation had yielded nothing tangible, yet it left Rebecca more certain than before that Emma was not merely an uninvolved observer in this matter. She finished her coffee, collected her coat, and stepped back into the cool air of the street. By the time she reached home, her thoughts had shifted from speculation to strategy. Emma might not have admitted anything, but she had confirmed one thing beyond doubt. She was a player in whatever game had begun. Rebecca had just set her coat aside when the telephone rang. She picked it up, expecting a friend or committee member, but the voice on the other end was not a social call. It was a reporter, and the question he asked would change the way she approached everything that followed. The reporter's voice was polite, even warm, but the question he posed landed with a weight Rebecca could feel in her chest. He introduced himself as Daniel Mercer from the Boston Chronicle, his tone carrying the smooth confidence of someone accustomed to speaking with people who would rather not take his calls. After a brief greeting, he asked, "Mrs. Coleman, I'm reaching out for a comment on recent concerns about the financial management of the Hopewell Literacy Foundation. Would you care to address them?" Rebecca's first instinct was to deflect, to request a formal email, to buy time. But she knew from experience that journalists often interpreted delays as evasions. She kept her tone light. "Concerns? That's a rather broad word, Mr. Mercer. Could you be more specific?" He hesitated for only a beat before replying. "We've received information suggesting certain expenditures in the Foundation's recent grant reports may not align with their stated purposes. I'm sure you understand why the public might want clarification. My editor is considering a piece on local non-profits, and the Foundation's name came up more than once." Rebecca felt her grip on the phone tighten. She forced herself to breathe slowly. "Mr. Mercer, the Foundation has always maintained full compliance with all relevant regulations. Any suggestion otherwise is misleading. If you would like official statements, I recommend contacting our communications officer." "I will," he said, "but given your leadership role, I thought it best to hear directly from you. These kinds of stories can move quickly, and clarity early on often helps avoid misunderstandings." The choice of words was deliberate. Stories can move quickly. It was a reminder that, in the court of public opinion, speed often outweighed accuracy. She ended the call with a promise to have the Foundation's office respond in writing. Rebecca stood for a moment in the quiet of her study, the receiver still warm in her hand. The timing was too precise to be coincidence. The note, the folder, and now a journalist's call. Someone was moving with intent. If the documents in that folder were now in the possession of the press, the situation had already passed a threshold she preferred never to approach. She returned to the locked drawer, opening it to look again at the folder's contents. Spread across the desk, the figures and annotations now carried sharper edges. She imagined them in the hands of a reporter who wanted to frame a narrative, each small irregularity magnified until it looked like a deliberate pattern. Public trust was fragile. She'd seen other charitable leaders lose it overnight. The natural suspect remained Emma Harris, but Rebecca could not ignore the possibility that someone else had seized the opportunity her public remark created. If Emma was involved, was she feeding information to the media, or was she merely aware of what others were doing? By late afternoon, Rebecca had called a trusted board member, Helen Morgan, whose steady judgment had served the Foundation well for over a decade. She asked if Helen had heard anything unusual. Helen's answer was cautious but telling. I haven't, but I did see Alan Green at the courthouse last week. He was in conversation with a young reporter I didn't recognize. You remember Alan? He left the board rather abruptly. Rebecca remembered very well. Alan Green had once been an enthusiastic supporter of the foundation, but his tenure ended after a public disagreement over program funding. He had accused her of favoring high-profile projects over grassroots needs, and their final board meeting together had been tense enough to make other members uneasy. That was nearly a year ago, and she had not spoken to him since. The memory sharpened her focus. Alan had access to these reports during his time on the board. He also had motive, resentment, perhaps even a desire for vindication. If he was speaking to reporters, he could have been the source of both the documents and the anonymous warning. The latter possibility intrigued her. Alan knew the subtle art of undermining without stepping fully into the light. Still, there was a complication. If Alan was behind this, where did Emma fit in? Had she discovered his activities independently, or was there a connection between them? Rebecca could not shake the image of Emma at the cafe, her measured tone, her refusal to either confirm or deny involvement. It was possible that Emma was entirely separate from Alan and had simply stumbled across the same information. Or, more unsettling still, that she was deliberately keeping her role ambiguous. Rebecca spent the rest of the evening drafting a brief statement for the Foundation's communications officer, clear, professional, and unyielding in its assertion of transparency. But she knew that words alone would not shield her if this campaign, whatever it was, that gained momentum. She needed to understand who was truly behind it and why. When she retired for the night, she found sleep elusive. The quiet of the townhouse felt different now, threaded with a sense of watchfulness. Somewhere, someone was preparing their next move, and she had only just begun to see the shape of the game. What she did not yet realize was that the figure she had considered her primary adversary, Emma Harris, might not be the one holding the strongest cards. That role could belong to someone else entirely, and uncovering that truth would alter the course she had been planning. The following morning, Rebecca rose earlier than usual, the faint unease of the previous day still clinging to her thoughts. Outside, the early light painted the rooftops in muted gold, but the beauty of the scene failed to soothe her. She went straight to her study, unlocked the drawer, and retrieved the manila folder once again. The papers lay there like an accusation, precise, organized, and ready to be twisted by anyone seeking to damage her. Her mind kept circling back to Helen Morgan's mention of Alan Green. The memory of his final weeks on the board resurfaced vividly. The clipped exchanges during meetings, his pointed remarks about misplaced priorities, and the way he had walked out of the last session without shaking her hand. Alan had always been articulate, persuasive even when his arguments lacked merit. That combination in the wrong circumstances could become dangerous. Determined to know more, Rebecca made several discreet calls. The first was to a fellow committee member who maintained social ties with some of the former board members. The woman confirmed that Alan had been seen recently at several civic events, often in the company of journalists. One in particular, a young man named Christopher Lang, wrote for an independent online outlet known for its investigative pieces on local politics and non-profits. The implication was clear. Alan was positioning himself as a source. Rebecca's second call was to an old acquaintance in the city clerk's office. She asked in the most casual tone she could manage whether Alan had been involved in any new non-profit ventures since leaving the foundation. The answer came with a note of hesitation. Yes, he had taken a consulting role for a small arts initiative, one that had experienced financial troubles within months of his arrival. Details were scarce, but the acquaintance hinted at internal disputes over budget allocations. The information lodged in Rebecca's mind like a seed waiting to take root. If Alan had a history of questionable management, it could undermine his credibility, but proving it would require careful work, and she could not risk being seen as openly digging into his affairs. By midday, Rebecca found herself considering Emma Harris again, but with a different lens. The possibility that Emma was not the instigator, but rather another witness, began to make more sense. If she had stumbled onto the same trail Rebecca was now following, her guarded behavior at the cafe could have been self-protection rather than hostility. Still, the risk was high. If Emma truly had no connection to Alan, approaching her directly about him could look like an attempt to recruit her, or worse, to manipulate her. But if she did have knowledge, an alliance could serve them both. Rebecca weighed the pros and cons with the precision she used in social maneuvering. Emma was sharp, connected in legal circles, and clearly unafraid of confrontation. She was also younger, which meant she might be more inclined to prove herself if given the right opportunity. The question was whether trust, even temporary strategic trust, could exist between them. The memory of their sharp exchange at the luncheon still lingered. It had been public, and public slights often left their mark. Yet Rebecca knew from experience that shared threats had a way of rewriting personal histories. She decided to gather more concrete information before making her move. In the late afternoon, she asked her driver to take her to a small legal library downtown, one frequented by attorneys researching past cases. She had no intention of conducting the research herself, but she knew the head librarian, a discreet man who owed her a favor. Over a quiet conversation in his office, she asked whether he had seen Emma there recently. He admitted that she had visited twice in the past week, both times requesting old public filings related to non-profit organizations, one of which was the Hopewell Literacy Foundation. The other was Alan Green's Current Arts Initiative. Rebecca left the library with a decision forming. The pattern was becoming undeniable. Emma's interest in Alan's new venture could not be coincidence. Whatever her original motives, she was looking into the same man Rebecca now suspected of fueling the media's inquiries. That evening, Rebecca sat alone in her sitting room, the soft light from the fireplace casting shadows on the walls. She thought about how quickly the narrative had shifted. Just days ago, she had seen Emma solely as a rival. Now she could be a potential ally, one with skills and access that Rebecca lacked. The situation demanded careful handling. Anna's overture too early could be rejected outright. Too late, and Emma might commit herself fully to her own course, leaving Rebecca out of whatever strategy she was developing. In that moment, Rebecca realized that this was no longer simply about defending her reputation. It was about controlling the story before others defined it for her. And to do that, she might have to work alongside the very person she had publicly challenged. By the time the clock in the hallway struck 10, her plan was taking shape. She would request a meeting with Emma, not by chance, not in passing, but deliberately and without pretense. This time, there would be no coffee shop politeness, no veiled remarks. She would present the truth as she now understood it, that Alan Green was the common thread, and that if they did not act, he would succeed in shaping a narrative neither of them could control. The thought was not entirely comfortable, but as Rebecca extinguished the last light in the room and headed upstairs, she knew that comfort was a luxury she could no longer afford. The next move would have to be bold, calculated, and entirely on her terms. Rebecca chose Monday afternoon for the meeting, selecting a discreet bistro in the South End, where the booths were high-backed and the tables far enough apart to make overhearing difficult. She reserved a corner table under the name of a mutual contact to avoid attracting curiosity. The winter light outside was cold and clear, bouncing off the glass facades of nearby offices as she arrived 15 minutes early. She wanted to be seated first, to control the setting before Emma appeared. When Emma entered, her gaze swept the room quickly before settling on Rebecca. She approached without hesitation, her coat neatly folded over her arm, and offered a polite but neutral greeting. Rebecca gestured for her to sit, and for a few moments they spoke of nothing. The weather, the pace of work, the usual conversational scaffolding meant to test the air before stepping into deeper matters. Then Rebecca leaned forward, her hands resting lightly on the table. "I'll be direct, Ms. Harris. I've come to understand that the recent attention surrounding the Hopewell Literacy Foundation may not be solely your doing." Emma's expression remained composed, but her eyes sharpened slightly. "Go on." "I believe a man named Alan Green is at the center of it. You may know the name. Former board member, left under strained circumstances. He now seems to be supplying the press with material designed to cast doubt on the Foundation's integrity." Emma did not immediately respond. She took a sip of water, setting the glass down with measured care. "That's a serious claim," she said. "I have reason to believe it's accurate," Rebecca replied evenly. "And I also believe you've been looking into him, his activities, his current ventures. That tells me we may have a shared interest in ensuring his narrative doesn't take hold." Emma's gaze held hers, unblinking. "If I have been looking into him, why should I involve you? The last time we spoke in public, you questioned my ethics. Rebecca acknowledged the point with a slight incline of her head. That was unwise, and I will address it. But right now we are both facing a problem that benefits from cooperation. You have investigative skills and legal insight. I have access to resources and information that may not be available to you. Together, we can dismantle whatever case Alan thinks he's building. The silence between them stretched. Around them, waiters moved quietly, the murmur of other conversations forming a distant backdrop. Finally, Emma spoke. What exactly are you proposing? That we work together, Rebecca said. Discreetly. I'm willing to cover any expenses you incur. I'm also prepared to share what I know, not just about the Foundation's finances, but about Alan's history with us. In return, I would ask that you help me anticipate and neutralize whatever he intends to release next. Emma's brow furrowed slightly, though her voice remained calm. You want me to act as your attorney? Not in any official capacity. Think of it as a private collaboration. You keep your independence, I keep mine, but we exchange information and coordinate responses. There was another pause, and Rebecca could see Emma weighing the offer. Trust was not something that could be conjured in a single conversation, especially between two people whose first encounter had been combative, yet the reality of the threat made pride a dangerous luxury. I'll consider it, Emma said finally. But understand this, I don't work for people I can't trust. And trust, Mrs. Coleman, has to be earned. Rebecca allowed a faint smile. I wouldn't expect otherwise. They spoke for a while longer, touching on what each already knew about Alan's recent movements, without revealing too much too soon. Rebecca noticed Emma's careful choice of words, her reluctance to speculate without evidence. It was the hallmark of someone accustomed to building cases that could withstand scrutiny. When they rose to leave, the air between them felt changed. Not warm, but no longer charged with the same antagonism. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows on the pavement as Emma walked away, her posture upright, her pace unhurried. Rebecca watched her for a moment before turning toward her own car. On the drive home, she replayed the conversation. Emma's guardedness was expected, but the fact that she had not dismissed the proposal outright was promising. Still, Rebecca knew that an agreement in principle was not the same as a commitment in practice. If Emma chose to work with her, there would be conditions, and those conditions might be more about principle than payment. What Rebecca did not yet anticipate was that the next contact from Emma would not be an acceptance, but a counteroffer, one that would test just how much she was willing to concede in order to secure an alliance against Alan Green. The following day, Rebecca sat in her study, a cup of tea cooling beside her, when the phone rang. She recognized Emma's number immediately, and without hesitation she answered. The tone in Emma's voice was different this time, measured but carrying a deliberate weight, as if she had already decided the shape of the conversation before making the call. I've considered your proposal, Emma began, without preamble, but I'm not interested in taking payment. If we're going to work together, it has to be on my terms. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, intrigued. And what are those terms? I want you to publicly retract your remarks from the luncheon, Emma said plainly. You implied that I won my case through loopholes. If we're going to present any kind of united front, your credibility and mine have to be intact. That means undoing what you did. Rebecca's fingers tightened slightly around the arm of her chair. It was one thing to apologize privately. It was another to make a public statement that acknowledged she had been wrong. In her circles, such gestures were rare and calculated. They could be seen as a sign of humility or weakness. But as Emma's request settled in her mind, she recognized the logic. The strength of any alliance would rest on mutual standing, and right now, Emma's was bruised by their very public exchange. That's a significant ask, Rebecca replied carefully. It's a necessary one, Emma said, her voice calm but unyielding. If you want my help, this is the cost. The silence on the line stretched for a few moments before Rebecca spoke again. Very well. You'll have your retraction. But in return, I expect full cooperation. No withheld information, no vague hints. If we do this, we do it openly with each other. Agreed, Emma said. I'll start by telling you what I know so far. Alan Green has been meeting with a freelance journalist named Christopher Lang. Lang has a reputation for chasing stories that can gain quick traction online. They've been seen together at least twice in the past month. I believe Alan has been feeding him selective excerpts from the Foundation's reports, stripped of their proper context. That's likely where Mercer at the Chronicle picked up his lead. Rebecca listened intently, absorbing the confirmation of what she had suspected. "Do you know where Lang is based?" "Downtown," Emma said. "He works out of a small shared office space near the Common. I've made discreet inquiries, and it appears Alan's visits have been late in the day, usually after regular business hours. That suggests he doesn't want their meetings to be noticed by other tenants." Rebecca could almost see the threads connecting now. Alan's quiet resentment, his access to documents, the careful choice of a journalist who operated outside the constraints of larger publications, but could still generate enough noise to cause damage. In the days that followed, she and Emma began exchanging information regularly. Emma's legal training gave her a way of dissecting details that Rebecca found invaluable. She traced Alan's recent financial disclosures, uncovering minor inconsistencies that, while not outright illegal, could raise questions about his credibility. Meanwhile, Rebecca tapped into her network, quietly gathering observations from people who had interacted with Alan since his departure from the Foundation. The alliance was not without its moments of friction. Emma's directness sometimes grated against Rebecca's preference for measured, layered communication. Likewise, Rebecca's instinct to protect certain information, until she was sure of its usefulness, tested Emma's patience. Yet each understood the stakes too well to let personal style derail the effort. Their breakthrough came one afternoon when Emma called with an update. "I've traced one of Lang's recent articles to a pattern in his sources. He's been cross-referencing public non-profit filings with internal notes he couldn't have gotten legally. That means someone is giving him access beyond what's public record. The language in his drafts matches the phrasing Alan used in old board meeting minutes. That's enough to establish a connection," Rebecca said. "More than that," Emma replied. "If we can show that Alan has a history of misrepresenting facts for his own advantage, we can undermine him before he can present his version of your Foundation's story to the public." Rebecca felt a cautious sense of momentum building. "Then we need to act before he does." They agreed to focus on one journalist, the same Christopher Lang who had been receiving Alan's information. Rather than approach him defensively, they would present a full, transparent audit of the Foundation's finances, leaving no room for the kind of selective framing Alan seemed to favor. It was a calculated risk. Transparency could reveal small imperfections that detractors might seize on, but it would also deny Alan the ability to present them as hidden faults. As the plan took shape, Rebecca found herself thinking about how improbable this partnership had seemed only a week earlier. The woman who had stood across the luncheon table from her, eyes sharp with challenge, was now sharing leads, strategy, and late-night phone calls filled with carefully measured revelations. It was still an alliance of necessity, but it had begun to carry the faint outline of something sturdier, the kind of mutual reliance forged in the presence of a common adversary. They did not have to wait long for Alan's next move, and when it came, it was bolder than either of them had anticipated. It was a grey Thursday morning when the news broke. Rebecca was in the middle of reviewing a draft statement for the Foundation's annual report when her phone buzzed with a message from Emma. The text contained only a short line. "Alan's making his move. Check the local news feed." Rebecca switched on the television in her study, tuning to a regional channel. There it was, a live announcement of a press conference scheduled for that very afternoon. The chyron read, "Former non-profit board member to expose financial misconduct." The accompanying footage showed Alan Green entering a rented meeting hall in the city's downtown district, followed by two assistants carrying thick binders. Emma called moments later. "He's calling reporters from 3 different outlets. That means he's trying to get this to hit more than one publication at once. If he succeeds, you'll be answering questions for weeks." Rebecca exhaled slowly, focusing her thoughts. "We'll have to get to the journalists before he does. Can we reach Lang?" "I've already tried," Emma replied. "He's not answering, but I know where he works. If we bring him the audit now and it's comprehensive enough, we might strip Alan's claims of their edge before he even speaks." Within the hour, Rebecca had contacted the Foundation's accountants, instructing them to prepare a complete and transparent report of the charity's finances over the last 5 years. Every figure would be explained, every expense categorized with its proper documentation. She knew this was the equivalent of opening the books to full scrutiny, but she also knew that secrecy would only play into Alan's narrative. By late morning, the documents were compiled. Rebecca and Emma met at the accountant's office, reviewing the material side by side. Emma's eye for detail caught several minor points that could have been misinterpreted, line items that were perfectly legitimate but might sound suspicious to the untrained ear. They worked to annotate each one, adding clear explanations so there could be no question about intent or compliance. At noon, they carried the bound report to the shared workspace where Christopher Lang kept his office. He was there, seated at a desk near the window, his posture tense when he saw them approach. Emma did the talking, introducing herself formally and explaining that they were there to provide full context for the information he might have already received from Alan Green. Lang was skeptical at first, his eyes scanning between them. "You understand that if there's a story here, I'm going to write it," he said. "That's exactly why we're here," Emma replied. "We're not asking you to ignore facts. We're giving you all of them. No selective documents, no missing pages. The complete record." Rebecca added, "If you want to write about the Foundation, write about it accurately. This is the truth, and it's in your hands before Alan's press conference. Decide for yourself which version serves the public better." Lang flipped through several pages, his brow furrowing as he read the annotations. It was clear that the numbers Alan had been using could easily be twisted if stripped of explanation. After several minutes, he closed the binder. "I'll look this over. I can't promise what I'll do, but I'll consider both accounts before publishing." They left the office without further assurance, but Rebecca felt a small current of relief. Lang had not dismissed them outright. That meant he was open to the possibility that Alan's narrative was incomplete. The hours leading up to the conference passed with a taut, watchful energy. Rebecca returned home, knowing she and Emma had done what they could to prepare. Still, there was no way to control exactly what Alan would say once the cameras were on him. At precisely 3 o'clock, the live feed began. Alan stood behind a table, stacks of binders in front of him, flanked by 2 people who appeared to be supporters. His opening remarks were measured but laced with insinuation. He spoke of patterns in spending, of questions the public deserves to have answered. Though he offered little in the way of concrete accusation, Rebecca watched from her study, her hands clasped tightly. Emma, connected on speakerphone, listened in silence. The reporters in the room began asking questions, and for a few minutes it seemed Alan might control the narrative. Then a voice from the back of the room interrupted with a question that visibly unsettled him. "Mr. Green," the reporter said, "can you comment on your own tenure with the Midtown Arts Initiative, where financial audits found irregularities in project funding under your oversight?" Alan froze for the briefest moment before attempting to brush the question aside, but the press smelled blood. Another journalist followed up, pressing for details. Soon, the focus of the conference began to shift, not toward the Foundation's supposed misconduct, but toward Alan's own record. In the space of minutes, the careful stage he had set began to crumble. His composure thinned, his responses grew curt, and the questions became more pointed. Rebecca exchanged a glance with Emma, even though they were not in the same room. They both knew this was not coincidence. Emma had found something, and she had chosen the perfect moment to let it reach the right ears. By the time the conference ended, Alan's departure was abrupt, his closing remarks drowned out by a swarm of questions he had no interest in answering. For Rebecca, the relief was immediate, but she also understood that this victory was not hers alone. Emma's timing and precision had turned the tide, and now she owed her more than just the retraction she had promised. The aftermath of Alan's failed press conference rippled quickly through Boston's legal and philanthropic circles. Within hours, snippets of his defensive responses and his abrupt exit were circulating online, stripped of the careful framing he had tried to maintain. The footage was unflattering. A man accustomed to controlling the narrative suddenly caught in the glare of questions he could not answer. For Rebecca, the shift in perception was almost tangible. Calls that had been tense and guarded earlier in the week became warmer, more supportive. Donors who might have hesitated now sent messages of confidence. But even as relief settled over her, Rebecca knew the change had not come by accident. Emma's quiet voice on the speakerphone during the broadcast replayed in her mind, every word precise. It was clear now that Emma had been the source of the question that upended Alan's momentum. She had found the thread of his own misconduct at the Midtown Arts Initiative, pulled it into the open, and let it unravel in front of every reporter in the room. That afternoon, Rebecca met Emma at the same South End bistro where they had first discussed their uneasy collaboration. The meeting was less formal this time, but Rebecca still chose a private booth. When Emma arrived, she took a seat with the ease of someone who no longer needed to assess the intentions of the person across from her. "I owe you more than an acknowledgement," Rebecca began. "That question at the conference, that was your work." Emma didn't deny it. "I suspected Alan's history with the Midtown Arts Initiative had not been entirely clean. It took a little digging, but there were enough public filings to make it clear he had mismanaged funds. I simply made sure the right journalist knew it in time to ask." Rebecca studied her for a moment. "You could have kept that to yourself, used it later. Why give it away now?" "Because timing is everything," Emma replied. "If I'd waited, Alan's claims against your foundation could have taken root. Even if I exposed him later, you'd still be dealing with the damage." This way, the shift happened in real time, while the cameras were still on. Rebecca allowed herself a small smile. "Efficient. Necessary," Emma corrected. They spoke for nearly an hour, going over the remaining risks. While Alan's credibility had taken a blow, Rebecca knew that people like him rarely retreated quietly. He might attempt to reframe the attack on his own record as a diversion from his evidence against the foundation. Emma advised vigilance, suggesting they monitor not just the media, but also Alan's contacts in the non-profit community. As the conversation wound down, Rebecca felt the shift between them solidify. This was no longer a temporary truce born of necessity. It was becoming something closer to mutual respect. They had navigated delicate terrain together, exchanging sensitive information, aligning their strategies, and anticipating their opponents' moves without undermining each other. In a world where reputations could be toppled by a whisper, such trust was rare. Leaving the bistro, Rebecca walked through the crisp, late afternoon air with a sense of steadiness she had not felt in days. The foundation's reputation had been preserved, Alan's credibility had been fractured, and the alliance she had once resisted was now an asset she valued. That night, as she sat in her study with the fire casting soft light across the walls, Rebecca drafted the first version of the public statement she intended to make at the next community event. It would be more than a retraction of her earlier slight against Emma. It would be a deliberate acknowledgement of her professionalism and integrity. She wanted the message to be clear not only to those in the room, but also to anyone watching from the edges of Boston's interconnected circles. This was a relationship built on strength, and it was here to stay, at least for now. When she set down her pen, she realized that her debt to Emma was no longer about repayment. It was about recognition, and she intended to make it in a way no one could mistake. The annual spring fundraiser for the Hopewell Literacy Foundation was always a polished affair, an evening designed as much for maintaining donor confidence as for raising actual funds. This year, the timing could not have been more significant. The event had been planned long before Alan Green's campaign began, but now it presented the perfect stage for Rebecca to address the lingering shadow of those recent weeks. The ballroom at the Fairmont Copley Plaza gleamed under its chandeliers. Tables were set with crisp linen, polished silverware and floral centerpieces in pale cream and blush. Guests mingled in a pre-dinner reception, their conversations marked by the careful balance of courtesy and curiosity. The events surrounding the foundation had not disappeared from the minds of those present, but the air carried a new tone, less suspicion, more interest in seeing how Rebecca would handle herself publicly. Rebecca moved through the crowd with deliberate grace, her navy gown understated but impeccably tailored. She greeted donors, civic leaders, and fellow board members with the same warmth she had always shown, but she could feel the subtle difference in their eyes. This was a test, one she intended to pass without hesitation. After the dinner service concluded and the murmurs quieted, she stepped to the podium. The sound in the room shifted to a focused stillness, all eyes on her. She began by speaking about the Foundation's mission, its progress over the past year, and the measurable impact of its programs. She cited numbers, stories of individual success, and the dedication of staff and volunteers. Only then did she pivot to the matter she knew was on many minds. In recent weeks, she said, her voice steady, there have been questions raised about the integrity of this organization and its leadership. I want to address those questions directly, here and now. She paused, allowing the weight of the moment to settle. The Hopewell Literacy Foundation operates with full transparency, as our complete financial audit has shown. Our records are open, our practices are sound, and our mission remains unchanged. She let the room absorb her words before continuing. At a recent public gathering, I made remarks about an attorney, Ms. Emma Harris, that were both unfair and unfounded. I implied that her professional success in a particular case was the result of exploiting technicalities rather than skill. That was wrong. Since that day, I have seen firsthand her dedication, her precision, and her integrity. It is important to me, and to this foundation, that I set the record straight. Ms. Harris is an asset to this community, and I am grateful for her work. The room was quiet for a beat, and then the applause began, polite at first, then building into something warmer. Rebecca could see heads nodding, the subtle signs of approval in a space where gestures were often measured. The moment was not just a retraction, it was a public acknowledgement of an alliance forged under pressure and proven by results. Emma was present, seated near the back, her expression composed. She inclined her head slightly when Rebecca's eyes found hers, a silent exchange that needed no further words. Rebecca closed her remarks with a call to action for continued support, emphasizing the role the foundation played in shaping the city's future through literacy. When she stepped away from the podium, conversations resumed with a noticeably lighter tone. Donors approached her table, offering not just pledges for the evening's fundraiser, but renewed commitments for the year ahead. By the end of the night, the foundation had exceeded its fundraising goal. More importantly, the atmosphere around Rebecca had shifted decisively. The doubts sown by Alan's campaign had not only been quelled, they had been replaced by a narrative of resilience, transparency, and collaboration. As the guests departed and the ballroom staff began clearing the tables, Rebecca lingered for a moment, looking out over the emptying room. The public gesture had been necessary, but the personal meaning ran deeper. She had defended the foundation, restored her standing, and acknowledged Emma's worth in a way that was both strategic and sincere. What she did not expect was that the next morning would bring a final gesture from Emma, one that would close this chapter not with strategy, but with something approaching goodwill. The morning after the fundraiser, the Coleman townhouse was unusually quiet. Thomas had left early for court, and the housekeeper moved softly through the downstairs rooms, tidying the remnants of the previous evening's preparations. Rebecca sat at the small table in the sunlit breakfast nook, her coffee still steaming, the newspaper folded neatly beside her. The night before had been a success in every measurable way, but she felt no rush to immerse herself in the day's business. When the doorbell rang, it broke the stillness in a way that was almost jarring. The housekeeper appeared moments later, carrying a small cream-colored envelope. "This was just left at the door, madam," she said. "No postmark, no delivery slip." Rebecca took it, noting the smooth weight of the paper, the deliberate choice of fine stationery. Her name was written in a neat, steady hand across the front. No title, no formal salutation, simply Rebecca Coleman. She broke the seal carefully, sliding out a single folded note. The handwriting inside was precise, the ink dark and even. "Consider us even. But if you ever want to work on something together again, you know where to find me." It was signed, simply, Emma Harris. Rebecca read the words twice, the corners of her mouth curving slightly despite herself. There was something in the tone, not quite friendship, not quite formality, that acknowledged everything they had endured over the past weeks without dwelling on it. Beneath the note was a check. The amount was substantial, drawn on a personal account. It was made out to the Hopewell Literacy Foundation, and in the memo line, Emma had written only 2 words: "For the work." Rebecca held the check between her fingers for a long moment, feeling the weight of what it represented. It was not simply a donation, it was a statement. Emma was choosing to attach her own name and resources to the foundation, to be seen publicly as a supporter rather than a distant ally. The gesture required no fanfare, no formal announcement, but its meaning was unmistakable. She set the check beside the note and poured herself another cup of coffee, letting her thoughts drift back over the sequence of events that had led to this moment. A chance encounter at a luncheon, a sharp public exchange, an anonymous warning, and a manila folder on her doorstep. Each step had seemed, at the time, like a small skirmish in an unpredictable contest. Yet together, they had reshaped her understanding of both her adversary and herself. She thought of the hours spent in quiet strategy sessions with Emma, the careful passing of information, the unspoken trust that had begun to take form even when neither of them would name it. They had not become friends in the conventional sense, but they had become something perhaps rarer. Two people capable of recognizing strength in each other, even when that strength had once been aimed in opposition. Outside the window, the street was waking to the day. A delivery truck idled at the corner, and a young man walked past with a paper bag from the bakery down the block. Life was resuming its usual rhythm, the city indifferent to the small dramas that had played out in its quieter corners. Yet for Rebecca, the conclusion of this chapter felt anything but ordinary. She returned the note to its envelope, placed the check in a separate folder for the Foundation's treasurer, and carried both to her study. The locked drawer that had once held the warning letter and the incriminating folder now seemed like a relic from another time. She opened it briefly, not to revisit the contents, but to acknowledge how far she had come from the unease of those early days. Before closing the drawer, she paused, considering. Then she placed Emma's note inside, not as evidence but as a reminder that adversaries could become allies, that reputation was both delicate and resilient, and that sometimes the most unexpected partnerships were the ones worth keeping in mind. As she locked the drawer and returned to the breakfast table, Rebecca felt the quiet satisfaction of someone who had weathered a storm and emerged with more than she had before it began. The foundation was secure, her standing restored, and in a strange way she had gained something intangible but undeniably valuable, the knowledge that when the next challenge came, and it always came, she might not face it alone. The sunlight edged higher through the window, catching the edge of the envelope on the table. Rebecca reached for her coffee again, a small smile still on her lips, and allowed herself the rare luxury of enjoying the calm. Whatever lay ahead, the events of the past weeks had proven one thing beyond doubt. She was no stranger to navigating conflict, but she was now far better equipped to choose her allies. And somewhere in the city, she suspected, Emma Harris knew exactly the same.